Russia's war on Ukraine has lasted over 33 months. Today we review the military situation there. I'm Julian Rupke and this is the BILD Situation Room. And we begin with bad news for Ukraine. The Russian invasion army has launched a new offensive in the southeast of the country, also in the Donetsk region. A surprise offensive towards a city where apparently the Ukrainian defenders did not expect it, or at least were not well enough prepared, namely Velyka Novosilka. That's the name of the town, a town from which last year, in the year 2023, the Ukrainian counteroffensive was supposed to launch southward towards Mariupol. However, it only reached about 12 kilometers that took around 3 months to fight for from the Ukrainian side at the time, and 12 kilometers that Russia has now covered in just 1 week. Towards Velyka Novosilka, we are looking at footage that shows us the Russian army is just outside the city. And these are the recordings that Russian bloggers have published. And we can clearly see the Russian tanks down here. These are 3 armored vehicles moving forward in the direction of the last line of defense before they reach the city, specifically towards that industrial facility standing here, and in the background it is quite clear you can see the buildings of Velyka Novosilka, which have long been a vital retreat point for the Ukrainian army, from where numerous attempts were made to advance last year, ever since the front has come to a halt there, and it has been roughly around 5 days in total. We'll take a detailed look at it on the map in just a moment. 5 days in which Russia managed to successfully capture an area measuring 70 square kilometers here and break through the Ukrainian front on a width of about 13 kilometers. We just saw that armored vehicles were used, but now we also see these buggies or these quads, these small units that Russia is utilizing. They are unarmored. It's a suicide mission for them if they get hit. However, if they succeed in getting past the Ukrainian lines, they are actually quite fast. They do 50 to 60 kilometers per hour in the field, even in time lapse, and can, in a very short amount of time, bypass the Ukrainian lines, successfully flank Ukraine, and then proceed all the way to the center of the city. Push forward, or at least get close to the city. We just saw this industrial facility, which apparently was the target of this Russian offensive. And we now see that Russian soldiers are inside with these defense lines, which we can see here, good bunkers. We can also see this on the side. This has been built over months, the whole thing, that they were conquered by the Russians. We have images too, which we won't show, of dead Ukrainian soldiers. Yet again, and this is likely the big problem, there were only a few Ukrainian soldiers. A handful maybe, who have defended this major position. We'll see it again shortly in another material. There is also significant criticism from the Ukrainian civil society and military experts that the trenches Ukraine has prepared, along with the very, very sophisticated installations, we note that they weren't occupied or properly staffed, allowing the Russians to advance easily without much resistance. We are now looking at these images and we remember, let me show you again from the very beginning, this was the industrial site just 1 kilometer from the city, and here we see Russian soldiers who, following the conquest, moved through this facility and subsequently brought it under their full control. And this shows us that the Russian army has advanced 8 kilometers in just 4 days at this point. Let's quickly show this from the start again. What we're seeing is that same facility merely a few hundred meters, or roughly 1 kilometer before the city. However, the Russian forces not only carried out an attack directly on Velyka Novosilka, but they also attempted an offensive on the connection road further to the north, and here they relatively far advanced towards Rostolny, reaching a small settlement that lies precisely along this connecting road. And here we have the same picture as before. We have one of these armored turtles, or whatever you want to call them, garages or something similar, which is very heavily armored and moves ahead. At the beginning, we observe these mine-clearing devices that are mounted here, and behind them there are various Russian vehicles that are proceeding along this path. Here too, it seems, initially didn't encounter much Ukrainian resistance until they had advanced quite far and reached the Ukrainian installations. So we can now see how the vehicles are firing at these rows of trees. We suspect there are likely Ukrainian defenders in there. They are now, as mentioned, being fired upon, and we'll see shortly that the large trench systems that were prepared here have already been crossed by the Russians, and that they simply maneuvered around them, progressing further towards the west. As mentioned, these are recordings of the Russian army. Soon we'll check the Ukrainian side, which presents things a bit differently. Nonetheless, it unfortunately caused quite significant problems for the Ukrainian forces as well. The facilities, as previously mentioned, that are being shelled here and are then subsequently taken over by the Russian forces. Ukraine portrays the whole thing as a defensive battle that has been at least partially successful. Let's take a closer and more detailed look at the whole situation again. These are now recordings from the Ukrainian side, likely depicting the very same convoy we just observed moments ago. That's the larger vehicle at the beginning, so to speak. It's recognized as a main battle tank, followed by a pair of MTLBs that are trailing closely behind it. There they are, all fully occupied with personnel. It's probably the same convoy of vehicles we just observed a moment ago. And now Ukraine looks like it has been very successful in striking against and subsequently destroying these vehicles effectively. However, we need to take a closer look at this. We have the large one at the beginning from earlier, the main battle tank, and then at least 3 infantry fighting vehicles or personnel carriers following it. But we'll see in a moment that what Ukraine actually destroys, what they managed to do, is only 2 vehicles that are taken out, or 3 vehicles. That means we have at least 1 which just arrived, and we also know from many earlier instances now we observe here the approach of the kamikaze drone, and we are aware from numerous previous attacks that it does not necessarily mean when the tanks and armored fighting vehicles are neutralized, so the infantry inside are not necessarily neutralized. This suggests that quite often they're immobilized, causing them to remain stationary at a certain spot, that they also get destroyed, the vehicles, but that each of the roughly 10 infantrymen inside then indeed occupy these new Ukrainian positions very far to the west. So here we see the usual formation. The whole thing is the presidential brigade. We can now see here that at least 2 of the vehicles were also disabled side by side. I think you can now see it quite clearly. Here they've both come to a halt, and Ukraine continuously maneuvers or flies their drones from the rear to strategically bypass the armor, ultimately aiming to destroy the Russian assault vehicles as effectively as possible. We also see the vehicles are empty here. That means probably the soldiers, as we just saw in the other material scene. They have jumped into the trenches that were previously occupied by the Ukrainian forces and have now successfully taken control of these trenches. In this specific case, this occurred northeast of Velyka Novosilka, in the area surrounding the village known as Rozdolnyr. Let's carefully examine the map now and see once again with closer attention how Russia has managed to advance in this particular region. As mentioned, we've often seen fighting in places like Kurachau over the last few days, mainly in the southeast of the country, not that far west, like we have experienced here. I'll just pause this very briefly. Here, yes, Kurakov is the place we have been concentrating on during the recent weeks and months. And Velyka Novosilka is roughly 50 kilometers further west and has been a place that has remained relatively peaceful and quiet so far. We're seeing the blue area again, as I had mentioned earlier. That was the Ukrainian counteroffensive 2023, which freed some areas here, but not many. However, let's keep it running for now and observe what has been happening in the recent days. What we're seeing now is the situation west-east of Velyka Novosilka from a week ago or even 5 days ago. And we actually see quite a large area here. Approximately 70 square kilometers that were still under the control of Ukraine, or at least quite strongly contested. Let's go ahead and set it in motion, observing thoroughly how it has changed or shifted over the course of just 5 days. And now we can observe that the red area as well as the orange area have quite noticeably shifted very far towards the west, and the city of Velyka Novosilka has indeed been directly reached. On the one hand, those were the first footage we just saw, where the fighting is moving right east of the city. And we also have gathered information not only from the videos we've been watching carefully, but also from our reliable map provider, Deep State Map, confirming that Russian troops have indeed invaded the area of Rostolny. This is a big issue for Ukraine, as there were only 2 roads, one being the road and the other to supply the city. The other one here couldn't be used, it's too close to the front. And of these 2 roads, one is already cut off, the other still functional. As I mentioned, the whole thing was a shock for the Ukrainian army, which had actually concentrated a few kilometers to the east on defending Kurakova and had deployed a lot of troops there. The Russians apparently picked up on this perceived weakness and subsequently advanced a distance of 30 kilometers further. To the west of that, they initiated a fresh offensive wave and remarkably, within just a few days, almost unnoticed by the world press, they managed to make a significant breakthrough in that region, pushing through a 13-kilometer wide swath into the Ukrainian front in this instance. We plan on venturing further into the Kursk region situated in the western part of Russia, and unfortunately the news coming from Ukraine to that area is not looking very good either. On the one hand, we see that the Russians have received massive support. We used to always say the 810th Marine Infantry Brigade was deployed there with several thousand soldiers. They were quite decimated by the Ukrainians, losing over 120 tanks and armored carriers. However, the Russians sent reinforcements, visible here with the flag. These are paratroopers from the Russian army, likely the 76th VDV division. The flag doesn't specify this, but it shows they are paratroopers, and they have initiated another offensive operation. Thus, another brigade consisting of approximately 3,000 soldiers has been deployed here by Russia. And in this case, they advanced towards the village of Darino, another village that Ukraine still held, which had been on the front line in recent days. And we can really see these massive damages in this agricultural area. We see it here, all the roofs where the Ukrainians had been staying before, what they had tried to expand into bunker facilities, into trench installations. This was relatively heavily destroyed by the Russians, who eventually raised their flag on it. Of course, this was not entirely surprising for the Ukrainians because they obviously knew that the Russians until the 20th January, until the inauguration of Donald Trump, will try to reclaim Kursk as best they can. And now we see the Ukraine acknowledges that at least 40% of the territory it was still controlling by mid-August has sadly been lost. Allegedly, Kiev says they still control 700 square kilometers. The maps rather suggest it's 450 square kilometers. Nevertheless, there's still a small portion, so to say, that is being maintained under control here. And once again, the most important city to control, Tucha, is not being fought over yet. This will be, if you will, the last battle for Kursk, for Tucha village. In the past, this place was home to 6,500 inhabitants, and it is likely going to be a decisive point, especially concerning the last stand of the Ukrainian presence here in the Kost region. We are looking at another recording and see that, as we recall, Ukraine had attempted to cut off a relatively large area, namely the Luskow district, from the rest of the country and establish a foothold here. To do this, the bridges over the Seam had to be destroyed, and we've seen quite a lot of attacks on these bridges. Now we see what the Russians have done. They worked massively with pontoon bridges or laying bridges built up on the rubble here, and now they have the possibility to drive across all these bridges again, and these mobile bridges are indeed sufficient to move armored vehicles and tanks over them. That implies Russia is making an attempt in certain ways to cross this river, Saim situated here. That works relatively well. However, we now see that Ukraine is also trying to attack these new bridges and using JDAM bombs, which are produced in the United States, the so-called GBU-39, that are being deployed here once again to effectively destroy the temporary bridges that have been constructed over this particular area. However, we can see that the Russians are extremely committed. They have built new bridges over all the ones that were destroyed. And the question is, of course, who will run out of precision bombs first, or who will run out of mobile bridges first? And indeed, the calculation quite obviously leans very clearly in favor of Russia. Let's take a look at the whole thing on the map before we have to check out another scene in Kursk. We had watched the footage from Darino, the location situated approximately here, which is now also under Russian control. Nevertheless, afterwards, we watched the footage from the Saim, and we do remember that's where the river flows along its path. The whole region was intended to be brought under control, and so all the bridges at Karuk, Svanoye, and Glushkovo were destroyed. As of now, every single one of these bridges has been reconstructed with efforts by the Russian forces. All in all, as mentioned, about 450 to 500 square kilometers still under Ukrainian control, and the key point is Sucha. Sucha is still completely controlled by the Ukrainian army, and until it's back under Russian control, Russia can't use those 1,000 soldiers there. They just can't deploy them to the Donbas region, thus it still effectively fulfills its strategic goal. I also mentioned another important scene that we really need to take a closer look at, a scene that was officially released by the Ukrainian army. And this particular scene is incredibly clear and communicates a substantial amount of information concerning how the two warring parties perceive the Geneva Convention, which frankly seems to be relatively minimal, namely relatively little if you indeed observe it. At this very moment, we can see another scene from the Kursk region where we can observe a BTR, either 80 or 82A, which apparently drove right over a mine at this spot here. We see quite significant damages in the road. Apparently a Ukrainian mine was placed here. BTR 82As were driven over them. It was heavily confirmed. We can also see in the footage, which needs to be pixelated, that at least 2 soldiers were killed. Nonetheless, there are indeed survivors in this Russian vehicle, and in order to evacuate these remaining survivors, the Russians have included a small transport van here. While it isn't visibly marked with a red cross, it becomes quite apparent from observing this particular scene that it is indeed functioning as an ambulance, a military ambulance, obviously now being used by the Russians in this context. Here, as we closely observe, survivors are being transferred from the vehicle on the left over to the one on the right. We see on both the left and right there are already bodies that have been laid down, but apparently there are some survivors that they are trying to evacuate. The Ukrainian drone is observing the whole situation, and now, quite interestingly, or a bit alarmingly, it's launching an attack with a kamikaze drone. Not aiming at the soldiers nor the damaged vehicle, but rather targeting the ambulance where the injured Russian soldiers are being cared for. The Russians are trying to defend it, so they're shooting here with their rifles. We now view the scene again from a different angle, from the kamikaze drone's view. Here is the BTR, the damaged vehicle, and over here is the ambulance on the side where the wounded Russians are located. And you can follow it until the very last moment, so there are definitely fallen Russian soldiers in there. We see it here, the twisted faces lying there awaiting transport. And the Ukrainian kamikaze drone then makes contact as we view the approach yet again from a different angle, and it hits that ambulance with remarkable precision, leading most likely to additional casualties and injuries amongst the Russian forces involved. We're presenting this to underscore the Geneva Convention, which in theory still exists today, although it's rarely adhered to in practice anymore. And this Geneva Convention of the year 1949 articulates with a fair amount of clarity in Article 39 that the transport of wounded and sick individuals should receive the same level of respect and protection as the units responsible for transporting these wounded individuals and, in this particular instance, victims of war. We clearly saw that the Ukrainians were fully aware that they were attacking a medical transport here. That means, and it's always important to note that they're not the only ones, the Russians do exactly the same. You identify the weak spots of the adversary, determine carefully where you can wound or kill the maximum number of opponents. And that's just how it is with patient transport, and therefore they specifically target it. We conclude our update on Kursk, and at this point we proceed onward, turning our attention once more to the eastern region of the Ukraine. We now shift our focus to the Kharkiv region. Kharkiv lies considerably further north, about 180 kilometers north of what we recently observed in Donetsk, in proximity to Velyka and Novosilka. And in that area, there's the small village of Kupiansk, which was indeed liberated by the Ukrainian army around November 2022. This liberation came after it had been initially seized by Russian forces at the very outset in March 2022. And this place was under Ukrainian control for 2 years. But now we see here the Russians have invaded once more. At least on the outskirts, it is noticeable that they're flying the Russian flag here, which indicates that the Russian military offensive in the northeastern part of Ukraine, namely in the direction of Kharkiv, also regaining momentum, where the Ukrainian lines, which have held relatively steady for over 2 years, have been breached, allowing villages within Kharkiv to be brought back under Russian control one by one. And we can also look at that on the map, and it just shows us once again that it's indeed, well, yes, it's pretty hypocritical to say that if we were to end the war now, we would be giving Putin what he wants, namely the Donbass or Ingolstadt, and then everything would be fine. However, we observe in this scenario right here, this is the region we just examined, as mentioned, a blue area, which signifies liberated, now turned red once more. The Russians also want to advance towards Kharkiv, which was not annexed at all. That means Russia's goal is not to deal with any people's republics or any annexed territories here that were, yes, annexed by Putin in September 2022, but they want to destroy the entire Ukraine. That, of course, includes the major city of Kharkiv with its millions of residents, which has been consistently under attack from the northern region since May and is now also being aggressively advanced upon from the eastern direction. This means the Russians clearly aim not only for Donbass or just Zaporizhzhia and Kherson in the south, but Kharkiv should also fall. And we see it in the Russian movement. Wherever they can advance, they do, no matter what. Whether these areas were annexed or are Russian or Ukrainian or not. We finish with an intriguing scene, I believe. At least this is my first time witnessing something like this. Here we observe the battle between a pair of kamikaze drones. This indicates one side has deployed a drone here to potentially destroy more vehicles. The opposing side apparently also noticed vehicles or soldiers within the vicinity. However, instead of discovering any vehicles or soldiers, the two drones here end up locating each other. And here you can see it quite well. The one drone moving in front of the other. The two drones align themselves, then proceed to collide directly with one another. This entire event was also captured on film by a surveillance drone. On this side we have the one drone on the left, and on that side we have the other drone on the right. And these two drones then fly directly into each other. There's an explosion after they, as mentioned, have aligned themselves and both are destroyed. So that's a very interesting structure or constellation which clearly demonstrates to us that the combat drone, which evolved from man against man, has shifted to drone against man in the recent years, and it increasingly appears to be becoming an issue of drone against drone. This represents a whole new form of warfare that we are presently required to confront and manage.